Welcome to Shalom Training. My name is Anthony. My Christian friend Billy once told me, I avoid reading the Old Testament. Is it relevant to us today? I don't know where to start. There are so many books in it. Can someone help me? Sure, I said. Let me show you a simple way. The Bible consists of 66 books. 39 books are in the Old Testament. The Old Testament are basically talking about creation, how God created the world, and how God dealt with Israel, and also the promise of Jesus coming. Billy replied, now I know there is 39 books in the Old Testament, but who wrote them? How are they grouped into? So let's answer the questions. Question 1. Who wrote them? The Old Testament are written by many people. Example, Moses, David, Solomon, Daniel, and others. Question 2. How are they grouped into? Well, they're basically grouped into a few groups. Basically are laws, history, poetry, and prophet. Oh, I see, Billy replied. Can you tell me more? Is there a simpler way to remember all this book? Okay, let me show you a simple way to remember all these books. In Singapore, our HDB houses are divided into 1 room, 2 room, 3 room, 4 room, 5 room, and executive flats. So let me use one of these rooms to explain to you. Let me use the 5-room flat to explain to you. Let's start with the flooring. The first 5 books of the Old Testament is called Law, namely Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Let's look at it one by one. The book of Genesis. The book of Genesis basically talk about 4 events. The creation of the world, the fall of man, the flood that happened during Noah's time, and the nation of the Jew. It also talk about 4 persons, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So when you read Genesis, all you need to remember is these 4 events and 4 persons. Next, Exodus. Exodus is talking about how God used Moses to bring up the Israelites out of Egypt. So it's basically talking about let my people go. God sent 10 plagues to the Egyptians to show them that he is God in charge. Then the Jews leave Egypt. It's also talking about the crossing of the Red Sea and how God gives the 10 commandments to Moses. Next, we look at Leviticus. Leviticus is basically talking about the law, how the Jew people should observe the law and how they should practice the festival and the ceremony. Next is Numbers. In the wilderness, there is about 2 million people walking together. So in Numbers, it's talking about numbering of each tribe. So how should they move as they walk in the wilderness? Deuteronomy is talking about second reading of the law. This is what happened. The first batch of people who left Egypt because they don't trust God, so they all died in the wilderness. During Deuteronomy time is another generations of people who rose up and they are about to enter into the promised land. And Moses read to them the law the second time. These 5 books form the foundation of the Old Testament. It's very interesting, Billy said. What about the next 12 books? Well, let's look at the next 12 book. The next 12 book is the history of Israel. It's talking about how they entered the promised land and what happened to them after that. The next 12 book, namely Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd King, 1st and 2nd Chronicle, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These 12 books are actually talking about the history of Israel. Let's take some time to look at it individually. Let's start with the book of Joshua. Joshua was commissioned by God to bring the Israel into the promised land. So Joshua brought them across the Jordan River and went into the promised land. In the book of Joshua is also talking about how the Israelites surround the Jericho wall for 7 days, and after 7 days, by shouting, the wall of Jericho collapsed. Next, let's look at Judges. After Joshua and the elders of that generation had passed away, the Israelites began to sin against God. They began to worship other gods, and because of that, they are being bullied by their enemy, and they start crying to God. And God sent judges like Gideon and Samson the strong man to save them. Next, let's look at Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. He followed his mother-in-law Naomi to come back to Israel. And then he met the relative king's redeemer Boaz. And subsequently he married Boaz and later became the grandmother of King David. Let's look at 1st and 2nd Samuel. The Jewish people decided to look for a king instead of submitting to God, and that makes Samuel's heart very sad. But God said it's okay. So he selected Saul. Saul was 1 head taller than the rest of the people, and he became the first king of the Israel. Saul initially was following God, but subsequently he also drifted away. And God chose another person, and this was David, the man after God's heart. And God put David to become king in replacement of Saul. 1st and 2nd King is talking about after King David passed his throne to King Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man in the whole kingdom of Israel, and also during that time. He built a temple, a beautiful temple, and then he also do a lot of fantastic things. But after King Solomon passed away, his son take over, and they are not totally following God completely. In the end, the whole Israel is split into two. The north belonged to Israel and the south belonged to Judah, and they have their various kings ruling over it. 1st and 2nd Chronicle is talking more details about the kings of Judah and Israel, and finally leads to Israel being exiled into Assyria and Judah to Babylon. Ezra, the book, is talking about some of the exiles returning back to Jerusalem, and Ezra was sent to there to teach them about the law of God. The book of Nehemiah was talking about Nehemiah going to Jerusalem to repair the wall of Jerusalem. And finally, Esther. The book of Esther was talking about Mordecai and Esther, how they saved the Jews from the evil Haman plot to kill all the Jews. Well, this tells us the story of the Israel. It is not so difficult after all. The 12 books are the history of Israel, and that form the left column of our 5-room flat. Let's look at another 12 book. We call it the 12 minor prophet, namely Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Why are they called the 12 minor prophet? Well, basically it's because they are shorter books, and they form the right column of our 5-room flat. What is the purpose of these 12 minor prophet? Well, during the times of the king after King Solomon's, some of the kings are not really following God. So God sent these prophets to talk to them. Basically, their job is to teach them and to warn Israel about their sin. The prophet is trying to tell them what God had to say to them and to warn them to come back to God. So these form our right column of our 5-room flat. I'm getting it now, Billy said. But there are still 10 books. Where are they? How are they fit into the Old Testament? Well, we can divide these 10 books into two groups. 5 books go to the poetry, and 5 books go to the major prophets. And let's talk about it bit by bit. First, let's look at the 5 major prophet books. They are namely Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The reason why we call them the 5 major books is because the books are longer. In the same way, after King Solomon, the kings are not following God very closely. Instead, some of them even worship other gods. God sent all these prophets to teach them and to warn them about their sin, asking them to come back to God, or else they'll be sent to exile. And finally, Israel was sent to Assyria, and Judah was exiled to Babylon. And finally, let us look at the last 5 books, the 5 books of poetry, namely Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. These 5 books are written by different authors. For example, Solomon teaches us about life and how we should live our life in the book of Proverbs. And he also shares with us the vanity of life in the book of Ecclesiastes. And he'll tell us the love story in Song of Solomon. In Psalms, David sings a lot of psalms to God. So whenever you feel down or moody, you can read Psalms. It will really enlighten you. If you want to learn to praise God or you want to worship God, you can also read Psalms. So this completes our 39 books of the Old Testament. With the last 10 books, it completes the roof of our 5-room flat. So now our 5-room flat have a foundation, a left column, the history of Israel, the right column, the 12 minor prophets, and the roof with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentation, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then the 5 books of the poetry. Well, God dealt with Israel in the Old Testament, but throughout the Old Testament, you also find out that God promised a Messiah, the coming of Jesus, and that's how it leads into the New Testament. Well, it's very interesting. Now I have a better understanding of the Old Testament, Billy said. Now I want to start reading, but how do I go about? Well, for exercise, let me suggest. You can start with the law, and then followed by history, and then poetry and the prophet. So I suggest you to start reading the book of Genesis. If you read every day 2 chapters, in 2 years' time, you will finish the Old Testament. Give it a try. You can make it.